Kara stood on her porch, gripping the baseball bat so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow with anger. The sound of laughter and splashing water carried through the night air, mocking her, taunting her. They were back. She had warned them, she had shouted, she had even called the cops. But these kids didn't care. They kept sneaking into her pool night after night, treating her backyard like a public water park. But tonight was going to be different. Kara took a deep breath and stepped forward, her bare feet crunching softly against the gravel as she approached the pool. The porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows over the backyard. The water rippled, disturbed by the bodies of the trespassers. Then she saw them. 4 figures waded through the shimmering blue, their dark silhouettes barely visible beneath the water. They were laughing, splashing each other, completely unaware of what she had done, of what was waiting for them. A sinister smirk crossed her lips as she tightened her grip on the bat. This time, they wouldn't get away with it. And then, the screaming began. Kara had never had a problem with her neighbors. She had moved to this quiet suburb in Georgia a few years ago, hoping for peace, for space, for a home where she didn't have to deal with loud noises and reckless teenagers. But that dream had been shattered the moment summer arrived. At first, she hadn't minded. A splash here, a little giggling there. It was normal for kids to be curious. She figured maybe 1 or 2 had hopped the fence just to see the pool. It was hot after all. But then, it kept happening. Every single night. Kara would wake up to the sounds of laughter, the unmistakable sloshing of water, and the occasional clinking of beer bottles. These weren't just kids sneaking in for a quick dip. They were treating her pool like a party spot. She had tried everything. She installed cameras. The next morning, she checked the footage and found blurred figures sprinting away, barely visible in the dim security lights. She put up signs, private property, no trespassing. The next day, she found one of the signs ripped off and thrown into the pool. She even called the police. But by the time they arrived, the kids were gone, leaving behind only wet footprints on the pavement. The cops had shrugged, told her they'd keep an eye out, and left. And then, she realized something. These weren't just any kids. They were the same ones she saw walking to school every morning, the same ones she overheard making snide comments at the grocery store, the same ones who looked at her with an expression she knew all too well. Kara wasn't stupid. She had lived in places like this before, places where people smiled at her face but whispered behind her back. She had felt the stares when she moved in, the curiosity, the subtle disapproval. A single woman, living alone, owning a house with a big, beautiful pool. They didn't think she belonged. And maybe, just maybe, these kids thought they were proving a point. But Kara wasn't the type to be pushed around. So she planned. She waited until the weekend, when she knew they'd come back. She prepared everything carefully. And when the sun went down, she turned off the lights and sat in the shadows, waiting. Then, just as she predicted, she heard it. The shuffle of sneakers against wood, the soft clang of the gate being lifted, whispered laughter, the splash as they slipped into the water, completely unaware that Kara was watching. Her pulse quickened. She counted the heads, 4 of them. The usual group. She let them have their fun, let them get comfortable. And then, she pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. The water stayed still, the kids still laughing. But then, a buzz, a sudden crackle in the air, and then, the first scream. It was a girl. She yelped, her body jerking, splashing wildly. Then, another voice, a boy this time, cursing, yelling. The water had changed. It was no longer just a cool summer escape. It was electrified. Not enough to kill, not enough to leave real damage, just enough to send a sharp, painful shock through their bodies, enough to let them know they weren't welcome. Kara stood by the switch, watching as panic set in. The kids scrambled, thrashing, fighting to get out. One of them, a tall boy with a baseball cap, tried to pull himself over the edge, but he slipped, his wet hands useless against the smooth tiles. Another girl gasped, her breath hitching as another wave of current passed through her body. Kara smiled. She had warned them. She had tried to be nice, but they had made their choice. Finally, the tallest boy managed to hoist himself up, dragging another with him. They stumbled, gasping, their eyes wide with horror. One girl was still struggling in the water, her limbs shaking, her voice choked with fear. The last boy grabbed her, pulling her up, their clothes dripping as they collapsed onto the pavement. For a moment, they just sat there, panting, staring at the pool in shock. Then, one of them turned and looked straight at Kara. His eyes burned with something darker than fear, something like hate. Kara didn't move. She just watched them, standing tall, the switch still in her hand. She wanted them to understand something very clearly. This was only the beginning. The boy clenched his fists, breathing hard. He looked like he wanted to say something, to threaten her, but he didn't. Instead, he grabbed his friend's arm, yanked her to her feet, and took off. The others followed, sprinting into the night, leaving behind puddles of water and the lingering scent of chlorine. Kara exhaled, her heart finally slowing. She had done it. But as she turned back toward her house, she couldn't shake the feeling creeping up her spine. Something told her this wasn't over. Kara woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing. The sun had barely risen, casting a dull glow through her bedroom window. She groaned, rubbing her eyes as she reached for the phone on her nightstand. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello? For a second, there was nothing, just silence. Then, you think this is over? The voice was low, almost a whisper, but filled with something venomous. Kara sat up, gripping the phone tighter. Who is this? A soft chuckle. You know who. The line went dead. A chill ran down her spine. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, suddenly wide awake. They were mad. She had expected them to be scared, maybe even embarrassed. But she hadn't expected them to call her. Still, she refused to let it rattle her. If they wanted to play games, they'd learn that she wasn't the type to back down. Kara stood up, stretched, and made her way to the kitchen. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, she glanced toward the backyard. The pool shimmered under the early morning sun, perfectly still, perfectly clean. No sign of the chaos from the night before. But something felt off. She stepped closer to the sliding glass door, peering outside. And then her stomach dropped. Scattered across her back porch were wet footprints, fresh ones. Kara's blood ran cold. They had come back, and they hadn't just been in the yard. The prints led right up to her back door. She locked eyes with the handle. It wasn't broken, wasn't forced, but the idea that someone had stood there in the middle of the night, dripping wet, staring into her house, watching her, made her skin crawl. She clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around the coffee mug. This wasn't just about the pool anymore. This was personal. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Kara kept herself busy, running errands. Anything to shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at her stomach. By the time the sun began to set, she had almost convinced herself she was overreacting. Maybe they were just trying to scare her. Maybe it was just some dumb prank. But as night fell, she realized something. She wasn't scared. She was angry. She had moved here for peace. She had worked hard for this home, and she wasn't about to let a group of reckless teenagers make her feel unsafe in her own house. So she got ready. She set up a chair in the shadows of her porch, out of sight, but with a perfect view of the pool. This time she wasn't just going to scare them. She was going to catch them. Hours passed. The air was thick with humidity, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, just past midnight, they arrived. Kara spotted movement near the fence, a figure, Then another. 4 in total, just like before. They moved carefully this time, like they knew she might be waiting. But what they didn't know was that she already had the upper hand. Kara reached into her pocket and gripped her phone. The second they stepped into the water, she was calling the police. This time, she'd have them caught red-handed. One of them whispered something. A girl giggled. They crept closer, inching toward the pool. But then, something changed. They weren't going to the water. They were heading toward her house. Kara's heart slammed against her ribs. She watched as the tallest boy, the one who had called her that morning, gestured toward her back door. The others hesitated, but then one of the girls nodded. They were trying to break in. Kara had seen enough. She shot up from her chair, flipping on the porch light. "Hey!" The group froze, their faces twisted in shock. Kara held up her phone. "I'm calling the cops! You better start running!" For a moment, they didn't move. Then, without warning, the tall boy smirked. "Go ahead," he said. "See what happens." Kara's stomach twisted. There was something unsettling in his tone, something that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Then, as if on cue, they turned and ran, vaulting over the fence and disappearing into the night. Kara didn't waste time. She dialed 911, her hands shaking. When the police arrived, they took her statement, nodded, said they'd patrol the area. But Kara could tell they weren't taking it seriously. "They're just kids," one officer said. "Probably just trying to scare you." Kara clenched her fists. "And what if they come back?" The cop sighed. "Then call us again." With that, they left. Kara locked the doors, double-checking every window. But no matter how many times she secured the house, she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching her. That night, she barely slept. And when the sun finally rose, she stepped outside to check the yard. What she saw made her blood run cold. Spray-painted across her fence, in dripping red letters, was a single message. "See you soon." Kara stared at the message on her fence, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "See you soon." The words dripped down the wood like fresh blood, taunting her, daring her to react. Her hands trembled with rage. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. This wasn't just some kids having fun in her pool. This was a threat. Kara's first instinct was to call the cops again. But she knew how that would go. They'd shrug, maybe file a report, tell her to install more cameras, and drive off. She was on her own. But she had one last trick up her sleeve. She inhaled deeply, forcing her nerves to settle. Then she went inside, grabbed her laptop, and began typing. If they wanted to play games, she'd show them exactly what it felt like to lose. That night, Kara sat in her darkened living room watching the security footage on her laptop. She had spent the entire day preparing, making sure every detail of her plan was perfect. And now, all she had to do was wait. And she didn't have to wait long. At exactly 12:47 a.m., her cameras caught the first sign of movement. The group was back, but this time there were more of them. Kara's pulse quickened. She counted 7 figures creeping into her yard, dressed in dark clothing, their faces barely visible in the dim light. They weren't sneaking in just to swim. They were coming for her. One of them, the tall boy, stepped forward, gesturing toward her back door. The others followed. Kara's lips curled into a smirk. "Right where I want you." She waited until they were all in the yard, moving toward the house. Then, with a single tap on her phone, the sprinklers exploded to life. But these weren't just any sprinklers. These were industrial-grade stink bomb sprinklers. The second the water hit them, the group recoiled, gagging, coughing. "What the hell?" one of the girls shrieked. The smell was unbearable. A mix of rotten eggs, skunk spray, and something even worse. A special formula Kara had spent hours preparing. Panic set in. They stumbled, trying to escape, but Kara wasn't done. From the side of her house, motion-activated floodlights kicked on, blinding them. A booming, pre-recorded voice blasted from hidden speakers. "Intruders detected. Police have been alerted! Screams erupted. The kids bolted, slipping in the foul-smelling water, tripping over each other in their rush to escape. Kara watched through the window, her arms crossed, her smile widening. They wanted a fight? They got one. By morning, the entire neighborhood was talking about it. The local Facebook group was flooded with posts. Anyone else hear that alarm last night? Smelled something awful coming from Kara's yard this morning. Hope she's okay. Kara simply sipped her coffee and scrolled through the comments. And then she saw one post that made her pause. A blurry photo of a group of teenagers walking through the streets, clothes drenched, faces twisted in anger. One of the comments read, "Looks like they got what they deserved." Kara smirked, but she knew better than to celebrate too soon. She had won this round. But was it over? A week passed. No more late-night intrusions. No more phone calls. For the first time in months, her house felt like her own again. And then, on a quiet sun. Day morning, a knock on the door. Kara's heart pounded. She peeked through the peephole and immediately frowned. Standing on her porch was a woman in her late 40s, wearing a crisp blue blazer and an expression so tight it looked painful. Beside her, the tall boy. His face was unreadable, but Kara saw it in his eyes. Hate. She opened the door slowly. "Can I help you?" The woman forced a smile. "I'm Mrs. Callahan. This is my son, Jake." Jake. So that was his name. I heard there was an incident involving him and his friends. Mrs. Callahan's voice was smooth, rehearsed. "I thought it would be best if we had a little chat." Kara folded her arms. "Is that so?" Mrs. Callahan nodded. "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. You know how kids can be. They make mistakes." Kara stared at her, unblinking. Breaking into someone's home isn't a mistake. Mrs. Callahan sighed, shaking her head. "Look, I'm not here to argue. I just think we should put this all behind us. No need to involve the authorities any further." Kara felt her jaw tighten. That was it. The Callahans thought they were untouchable, that money, power, or a well-placed smile could make this go away. She glanced at Jake. His lip curled in a sneer. He wasn't sorry. She stepped forward, lowering her voice. "I'll tell you what," she said. "I'll drop this, under one condition." Mrs. Callahan perked up. "Of course." Kara leaned in. "Your son and his friends never come near my house again. Not my yard, not my pool, not my street. If I even see him looking in my direction—" She pulled out her phone, tapping the screen. A video started playing, security footage of the kids breaking into her yard, of them trying to get into her house. Jake paled. His mother's smile faltered. Kara locked eyes with him. "Next time, I don't call the cops. I call every school and employer in town and make sure they see this." Silence. Then, finally, Mrs. Callahan exhaled sharply. "Fine." She turned on her heel, grabbing Jake's arm. "Let's go." Jake glared at Kara one last time before yanking his arm free and stomping away. Kara watched them go, waiting until they were out of sight before stepping back inside. She locked the door. Then she smiled. Game over. By the time summer ended, Kara never saw the kids again. Word spread fast. The rumors alone were enough to keep others from trying their luck. Her house? Untouched. Her pool? Hers again. And as she sat on her porch one evening, enjoying the peace and quiet, she let out a satisfied sigh. They had thought they could scare her. They thought wrong.